Our Mish-Mashing Street Fighter V Monday Battle Lounges. I am Kanzuki Dynasty, and we have Rillian here. Back again this Monday after a bit of consolidation since our last tournament, and getting back into the grind.
We had quite a lot of data from Frosty Faustings, mostly in Guilty Gear actually, but there was a fair amount of Street Fighter data as well. From all levels of play, we moved on to understanding stuff about our styles that don't necessarily work out that well at the tournament level, and things that, surprisingly for some of us, worked really well at the tournament level, and therefore are likely to get a bit more attention. Unfortunately, Cosmic Wolf did not go with us, and obviously DeWolf and Suntier, who are not necessarily in the lounge as yet, were not at this event either, but we also picked up some information about things relative to them in the last 2 weeks when we were doing training for those who did bring home new ideas to try out. Cosmolf currently playing Akali as a generality to get used to and back to certain flows in terms of how the character should and could be used. Not necessarily because of any changes in Season 4, but just because he felt like going back to Akali for a bit. Siren having found that it's actually relatively simple to get players at tournament level, or with the tournament mindset, depending on how you look at it, to have to play footsies. Whereas you know, we generally say you should try working on anti-airs and make sure that bots have a lot of jumping options just to make you not focus on the ground constantly, even though obviously at higher levels people jump less, and they don't take as many chances with it when they do jump, so you can often get away with just blocking.
Round 1. Fight!
In terms of Season 4 specific things, however, we have been taking inventory of what the top players of various characters have been trying to do with them, and some opinions that have been going on for the last month and 3 weeks now, is it? So shout out to Ultra David for the DHC, and to various uploaders who grab high level matches, put them on YouTube and so on, because it lets us take a look at how people are thinking about the game at that max level. But the main thing we've been looking at based on that is seeing when high level players have styles that look as if they shouldn't necessarily work. It's easy to get discouraged when someone tells you that's a bad idea, but then it can be a little bit comforting to go back and find yourself watching a high level match and going, oh look, this person does exactly what I do. Now, this isn't to say you should just immediately start doing it again because you don't know why they're able to get away with doing it. But if you understand enough about the game, you can study that. You can look into why it is that they get to do the thing, timings and spaces that they do it. And if you're familiar with or like those timings and spacings, then it really means you might as well keep doing that thing. Even if you have a bit of a struggle to get good enough to make sure that you are doing it correctly. The team, of course, has the benefit of very precise laser focus training even with our bots, because as we mentioned before, while the bots are given as straight up training tools where there's not a whole lot of consideration given to the many ways you could use it if you have very specific goals, internally we do have a lot more ways that the bots get used, which is why we constantly mention if you do have anything you want to ask about, then please let us know. Contact page 2-mk.org, and we may have a suggestion or two for you.
Alright then, now with my controls fixed.
So we are looking at two shifts in flow and style from both sides. Fortunately for us, both of these are spacing related, which means that these two players are, as usual, going to give each other stress. This is even more useful because each of them has the capacity to frustrate and shift the stylistic goal of the other. Amara's recent developments have mostly to do with keeping the opponent from advancing, or moving back to a space where, if they jump, they will almost certainly get anti-aired. But Karine can cover a lot of space quite quickly, and Siren doesn't really jump. Forcing Ryu to either move forward or find another way to get into that precise space where throwing fireballs or dashing is something you actually have to think about as the opposing player. The easy answer to this actually is something else. We've been watching one of the higher level Ryu lately because this player has a very similar style to Amara, just at a generally higher level. And the way that they solve this problem is exactly an example of what I was just talking about. They solve the problem by just jumping in, which you'd think, well, why would you do that? This is supposed to be high level, why jump so much? It's because everything else they do, which really is very similar to what she does, means that it's so likely that the opponent will do something at the moment they jump that they end up landing the jump. So, while it will obviously be a very hard road to specifically choose, you know what, I'm just not going to give up jumping in. I'm going to go through however many ranks I can with a ton of people who are generally prepared to anti-air you and trying to set up the anti-air, because that's what you are supposed to do at these. At levels basically up to gold, you should basically spend most of your time looking to anti-air. And decide, I'm gonna figure out how to make it so I can jump anyway. But it's obviously not as simple as jump a lot. You have to set up a lot of situations and make your opponent think about a lot of things. What makes jumping work for that player is that they build up a huge mental stack on the opponent before they start jumping. And what usually makes jumping fail for beginner players is that they don't have the time or the understanding to set up all of those layers. If you watch high level play, when people jump, they very rarely actually get anti-aired. They don't jump as often, but sometimes they'll just jump twice back to back and still get away with it. Because they've learned the timing to make the opponent think about this as something they're not going to do. With Karin's ability to anti-air a little bit compromised relative to Ryu's jump-ins, this makes it relatively stronger. They're very likely to trade. Ryu has one or two tricks he can use to make sure he doesn't get anti-aired, even though they don't necessarily give him damage the way they do for Ken. And if pushed into a corner, he can just go back to playing the ground game immediately, with very little benefit to his opponent to spending a lot of time watching the air. They can get chipped down with fireballs, hit with lots and lots of lows, or similar, because they don't really want to spend too much time thinking about, is Ryu going to jump or is he going to hit buttons in neutral? They would like to be able to think, well, it wouldn't make sense to jump, so I just have to beat him in neutral. But he's quite a good jumper as a character. Zoners generally are, because they have such long jump heavy kicks, meaning that they generally don't have to worry about being anti-aired by an unprepared opponent. This is part of what makes Guile jump-in strong, is making Sagat jump-in fairly strong. And Zeku's doing decently as well. The space control-y type zoners have a little bit more trouble with this because obviously they don't have the same heavy kick tools in the first place, but the ones that do the mostly oppressing with long-range attacks do a fairly good job of keeping this in mind.
For me, all of that is relevant because one of the things that I've been trying to effectively start adding to my style and really getting properly into what I'm doing is, in fact, my crouch heavy punch anti-air. I'm relatively decent with the stand heavy punch, but it doesn't really cover all of the situations and all of the jump types. And the crouching one can cover more, but it requires a sort of extra bit of awareness. And so we talked about a method that I was using in part to help my awareness and get used to paying attention to everything I want to at once. In one of our previous streams, a bit before our Frosty Faustings tournament. But lately it's fundamentally a combination of trying to put that together as well as everything else that I'm already doing. Along with, on top of all of that, figuring out various style points about when I want to approach or not, and effectively figuring out how my spacing is supposed to work in certain situations, what I'm supposed to, stylistically supposed to do. And so continues my usual quest of trying not to go in constantly and all of that, and build the foundations that I need to be able to be comfortable otherwise, including but not limited to the ability to defend myself when I'm playing neutral, from the air or otherwise.
In our previous touching on that, we had another example of the internal specifics where the team gets, this bot is not ready for this purpose, but there's a way to use it for that. And Bison Bot being Siren's general training partner for those situations. Making sure that the crouch heavy punch anti-air happens only when the opponent moves into the air, and for characters who have options that don't involve simply just coming right back down, learning to delay it at least enough to deal with that. Bison is a good bot to do this on, as mentioned before, because if you have a crouching anti-air that you must learn to do, and you must learn to do it in time, any character who has a stomp or a similar move can be useful to you. But not all of the bots are built to actually do that, even if they have such moves. Bison is definitely one of our best options in that regard, as he will simply head stomp you, and he has lots of different head stomps for you to deal with.
Indeed, and so that actually becomes all sorts of interesting things, because not only are you trying to get your, in my case, Crouch Heavy Punch anti-air together, while keeping track of his ground approaches with scissors, slides, and all of that. The fact that he's varying his specific approach so much means that it requires an even higher level of awareness in certain ways, because sometimes you need to, like, walk back a little bit and then Crouch Heavy Punch, or other such things. And have to effectively be paying attention to what he's doing and where he's going, even when he's early into his jump. On the other hand, this makes you very aware of exactly what spacings your tools work at and what they don't, which can also be extremely useful. That's where I've been lately, and among a couple other bots that I've also been poking at, I am in the phase of trying to figure out exactly what I have to do in each of the different various stomps and situations.
But given the report I got, the suggestion was actually to switch to Edbot, because the thing that Urzarin mentioned to me was she was dropping it not because it was specifically hard to do, but because of mental stack issues. It was too difficult to make sure everything was going correctly and still get the Crouch Heavy Punch anti-air against an opponent who could jump at basically any time, especially if they didn't jump all that frequently.
Yes.
Our Edbot has little anti-air focus. He does have, I think, is it even in his point system? I don't even remember. Because it does not come up.
Have both anti-air and air-to-air.
I'll check it, because I don't remember Ed having that specific one. However, Ed is one of our easier bots, and I generally tend to remember bots by their hardest setting, because it just helps me keep them in mind. But again, it has also to do with the fact that you can sometimes use a bot in a different way altogether if you don't have the same focus as usual. So even though Ed is in fact listed as both anti-airs and air-to-airs as the points, the way that you have to fight Ed and most of what you're doing against him can be compounded if you specifically choose to do more than you were doing before. In other words, if you were focused entirely on waiting for Ed to put himself in those situations so you could anti-air, that would be easy. But you could also choose, entirely for your own personal training, to try to focus on playing the ground game as you normally would, and then have to anti-air him anyway.
And when you put together all the points on the bot, he can take quite a bit of mental focus just trying to figure out when on Earth you have the opportunities for things like dash throwing him. So I've had plenty of ground respacing and attention, just off of that even, in terms of my, at least initial work on Edbot.
as we also mentioned, this year is moving into more focus on execution and specifics of execution in terms of requirements for doing damage, and therefore getting to probably higher ranks by managing performance stuff rather than just mental stuff. As a result, since they were cheap, there are at least 2 more people with all of the Season 1 characters added to their setup. Meaning that we have more bots to use that were not used before, generally to figure out whether or not it would be meaningfully crippling to have certain bots missing. In terms of what the bots themselves specifically do as advertised, generally the answer was no. But all of those custom things tended to matter a lot more, meaning that having no Urian bot, for example, was a big deal. Or having no Alex bot is a big deal in a different way, even though these bots don't specifically aim to teach you anything character related, and often they don't have very character related things in the first place. A good example is that part of the reason our Alex bot is built the way it is because the Alex matchup is so generally dependent on either the player or your own character. It's Alex that does most of the work in matches to figure out how to deal with his opponents. You mostly have to get out of the way of a few things and not get pressured in a very specific way. But that doesn't mean that once a player has decided to play Alex at a high level, that you can just go, oh, I don't need to know this matchup. It's not a matter of the fact that you don't need to know the matchup. It's that the bot, it can't teach you the matchup. It can teach you how to deal with specific moves, and that's about it. Alex does suffer a bit against Ryu's heavy punch though, as most characters do, honestly. And has to take a lot more risks if he wants to get in on a Ryu player who is aware enough to hit it. We see they will force it to retreat, but Noyamar will follow, allows him to get the kick.
I actually had the opportunity to fight a different Alex for a while in a lounge a little while ago, and it sort of pointed that out, that he was a very different experience from DeWolf's Alex, and the way that I had to approach the matchup ended up being somewhat different overall, just as a result of that. And this is obviously the same between different styles of most characters, but it was just a notable and pronounced difference. At least for me, as someone who hasn't fought that many Alexes most of the time.
Round 1. Fight!
That was a little excessive, but when you're primed for something, that is what happens.
Round 2. Fight.
Despite making no effort to put the matchup in, we do tend to try to get most of the special moves or really, really well-known combos of a character into every bot so that you can just get used to that as a physical thing. You see this and you have a response for it. And of course, they are generally meant to be isolated along with whatever notes you can find on the bot's page to tell you which actions you need to turn on if you only want to practice against that. This is usually more helpful to us than the CPU, though we do have a few bots that entirely do not do certain moves because the CPU is so consistent about it. Specifically Abigail and a couple Dawson things, where we just leave it to the CPU to teach you that because it does that a lot or is good at it, or at least if it does it repetitively, it does it in a way that will generally give you hard work. Alice is not that type of character. It's a little troublesome when the character is like Alex, where the system will basically read your inputs and therefore just decide it will do this at the timing when it's most likely to either punish you or be super difficult to stop.
Looks like you could use more training. Round 2.
From the wolf side, it has been training in our Dragon Ball FighterZ bots because of a lowered general awareness, making it difficult to play his preferred style. He has trouble getting in on people quite often. In fact, we have mentioned previously that there gets to a point where he has very little offense, and you can beat him by just standing still and not worrying yourself too much. Therefore, he was unable to really get much going without getting into a position where he could hit people who had just done some small thing. Now, of course, you can still get away from him until he builds up a certain level of offense by just not doing pretty much anything. But that helps us rotate around, as we now have a player who will basically punish you for taking any move that is not part of your style or intent, and give you a run for your money in that regard. If you don't have a really good reason for what you're doing, if you're just hitting buttons because things are quiet and you don't know what else to do, you'll probably get beat up for it.
Especially when put against a player whose problem is that they tend to hit too many buttons, such as myself. Because that is one of the main problems that I've run into in the development of my style, and the related training that I've been sort of working on lately, is that I built up all these habits, and honestly I'm sort of just the type of person to hit way too many buttons relative to what I should, and when I get into a situation where I'm not happy with things, the answer often is more buttons, even when it shouldn't be according to either my style or whatever else. So DeWolf's tendency to punish, as Rillian explained, anything that's not a proper part of one's style. It does give me a bit of trouble.
He's also very good at helping train you to walk around and limit your attempts to stick out buttons to check advances a bit more, as Alex is really a character who is often going to be able to whiff punish them, even if it's not a true whiff punish. He has to be super expecting it. But it's much easier for him because he knows I'm quite far out. The opponent is not likely to do anything serious because I'm too far out for them to hit me. But they don't want me to dash, they don't want me to do slash elbow, they don't want me to do certain forms of lariat and so on, so they're probably going to hit something. And even if he's wrong, most of the time he's not the more whiff punishable character. And even if you clip him, the confirm from that clip does not necessarily lead to a lot of damage either.
So, as a result, he is, well, sort of a frustrating opponent for me, one that I do kind of need to face.
Round one. Fight.
However, when certain parts of your style are missing, it can become really crippling. Which is why it helps to have spotters to tell you things like you are not walking anymore and you're not hitting forward medium kick.
I'd noticed the forward medium kick, but not where to insert it. The walking, however, I had missed. But I do seem to be using Seppo entirely.
And that is actually how that often goes. You can feel yourself thinking, I don't know where I use that move, because you've dropped something else that leads to the situation where you use it. The reason why there is no real timing for using the forward medium kick is because there isn't any walking. Karin is a character who is very good at walking in and out of the range that people think she can be hit, and then immediately hitting a button to punish their attempt to hit her. But if you do not do this, then she actually becomes a relatively slow and sort of bland character, because most of her strength in terms of special moves is locked behind doing confirms or actually being much further away than her footsies. You can think of Karin as a character who has more styles of shimmy than other characters in the game, for the most part. That overhead allows her to have a stronger shimmy game than Cammy, and the range of the extra Senha and the ability to do it without having any charge makes her have a different setup than Shinli does, even though the two of them are pretty much equal.
On a more mechanical level, I really need to learn the exact spacing where I need to change to Mayo can crush counter punish. There we are.
This was actually part of what we were working with as a question out of the match that Rune Siren had at Frosty, which was mostly this opponent can be handled, but I'm missing one move, one normal. And without that one normal, the match morphs into something else entirely, making it very difficult to actually play.
Round one. Fight.
Cosmic Wolf had similar problems for a little while, in that if you use Nakali's moves in certain spaces, he's one of those characters where you don't really have a lot of interchangeable moves. He seems very simplistic in that regard, but to play him properly, you have to hit specifically this at specifically this situation. Not necessarily spacing, not even per se timing, but rather thinking about what your opponent is thinking about, or intercepting something that they have planned. But because of the very specific forms of most of his normals, each one only serves one purpose. Nakali's crouching medium punch, for example, has a very specific job. His light kick has a very specific job. His light punch has a differently specific job, and so on down the line. He's really not a character where you can just go, I'll just hit the closest thing that is about the right number of frames. This is actually true for a lot of characters in this game as a whole, but Nakali is more important in this because he's not really a character who can get damage quickly without doing this. He's similar to Karin in that he generally has to confirm some things. And confirming those things without enough charge is quite difficult.
Yes, in that particular regard, I do not envy charge characters.
You should though. Envy us. We get better moves than you.
Oh. I suppose you can...
Round one.
Afford is a weird word, but is sort of close to the concept desired. That. What on earth? There. On the other hand, you should envy me, because I do not have to have charge to confirm my things. That said, I have never played a charge character, so I wouldn't technically know necessarily. Oops. There's the DPS baiting.
One of the great uses of our new Kagebot is that he has what I have in my own head called the 3-point moment. When playing at this level, there's often a situation where you have just gotten out of footsie range with your opponent. You're waiting to see what they do. You're expecting them to advance. They don't move backward. you don't feel like attacking. So it's 3 points. First, the recognition that, oh, footsies for now might be over. My opponent walked out of the standard range where we're both scrambling and hitting buttons and hoping that the other one gets hit. They might be waiting for me, but that's where we are. That recognition that they might be waiting for you to act means you don't necessarily want to. But now you're in that moment where, what exactly do we both do here? Which of us is going to go for the attack first, and will that person be wrong? And then the realization that your opponent could jump. And if your opponent happens to move at that, it's that moment where you've thought to yourself, oh right, but they might jump. But the movement is not a jump. Chances are you will do something that is also an anti-air. In fact, characters who have harder anti-airs are in a way luckier in this moment because they don't actually do anything there. Of course, they're also crippled by the fact that if the opponent does jump and they aren't ready, then they've been jumped on. But it's one of the hardest moments in fighting games as a whole. I mean, across almost all fighting games. Your opponent is at a range where they can do unreactable things. You might have tools to beat those things, but you don't know which one to use. And normally the mind just goes, pick something, act, move randomly. This is extremely dangerous to you. Kage has been useful in the sense that he makes it really easy to see when that happens to yourself. Unlike our Nashbot, whose job in autopilot is to help you learn to autopilot through your punishes and so on, and BirdieBot, whose general purpose is to make sure that you have an autopilot that you can turn off and spend more time thinking. Kage's job, as far as we've seen it so far, is to make you recognize that moment. Because unlike the other two where you are autopiloting something that is specifically dangerous or negative, there is no way to know what the wrong or right decision is in that moment without either understanding your opponent quite well, their character quite well, or both. And similarly, Kage is the sort of character where he also just has a ton of weird options that you don't know which one he will pick, and the bot does a decent job of simulating this. We didn't actually give him the Tatsu thing because people seemingly don't use that for that purpose yet. Maybe there's a way it will become useful later, but for now we've left him without the Tatsu. The main thing to understand is that that moment is itself janken. It is not necessarily a mix-up. Depending on your character, it actually is a mix-up. But you do have to make a decision, and there's a decent chance that unless your opponent does something super reactable, which no one does at that range, or things are less reactable at that range in the first place, you're probably not going to just beat them out. Not every time anyway. It's important to take that feeling and come to terms with it, more so than it is something you have to figure out. Because if you're trying to go up in ranked or just playing casuals, you don't really have a lot of time to figure out for each and every opponent what goes in that slot. It is one of those times where you really do have to go with your gut to some extent, but you also need to learn to observe what happens when you do. As players get more and more experience, they will be less shaken, they will move more cleanly in certain situations, and yes, you will have to come up with more good responses. But it's often the case that players will start off by thinking, okay, I know what you're going to do now. You've done this the last time. And understanding what to do with that can be really important. You can basically boil it down to two types of people. The type that thinks you're going to repeat something, and the type that thinks that you're not. Not everyone can be categorized like this, however. Obviously, the Wolf is not really a player who actually thinks either thing. He just also follows his gut almost entirely in these situations. Just does whatever feels right, and it can work out sometimes, and obviously it can sometimes not. There are a couple of moves in the game that are quite helpful here simply because they are barely reactable. They put the player in a position to maybe react in time, but often the reaction is forced into a flinch and so on. Originally, when you're starting out coming up through the ranks, it's actually jump that does this, because we take a while to learn to react to the jump. And then we take a while to learn to react to which jump it was when we start to face opponents who have a lot of cross-up spacing experience and so on. But as you get faster and faster in the game, and get more experience watching certain characters do certain things at certain speeds, it becomes easier to tell whether or not you should do something in a moment just from a quick couple frames of startup of whatever. But even though we end up learning, okay, I can totally anti-air, these games are designed around you being able to respond to things other than just jumps. As you get higher and higher in the ranks and higher in your skill, you will end up doing things like whiff punishes, which are really quite fast reactions. They're reacting to something that you are expecting, that you have primed yourself to watch for. But in that way, they're not really different than the jump itself. You expected your opponent to take action A, they did, and you were ready. There are, however, characters who are very confusing and stressful because they have two options that either look similar or require drastically different responses, no matter what they are. Kage is the easy version of this because as far as we can tell, he really isn't that type of character. He does have some potential to start stuff if you react by blocking. But if you are reacting by moving or reacting by trying to counter-strike him, you often can learn to deal with him. The higher level version of this is Ibuki, who you actually have to learn a lot of things in order to respond to. And that is of course why our Ibuki bot is packed full of pretty much everything we know that Ibuki can do. And we're very thankful that when VT2 was added, for some reason, it seems as if the Fuma Shuriken mix-ups were already in the bot we made, so good stuff, I guess. Probably not the more advanced ones, but these are, after all, primarily for players trying to get to silver so that they can face opponents who have specific skills, or to be used in more advanced ways in silver to get up to gold and face opponents with different mindsets.
Round 2. Fight.
If you are not familiar, the other aim of bots is to simply help people who don't have the time to do all the mechanical training in real matches, or don't necessarily have the greatest connection to too many other players, giving them the option of getting their practice and making the best of their Street Fighter time while still setting their restriction on who can and cannot connect to them to something like 4 or 5 bars, and accepting the more occasional match that results.
And so we see with the walking around properly and the forward medium kick added, things go better.
It's go time. Let's do this.
Yes, outside of anti-air stuff and all of that we had been discussing with Ed and BisonBot, Kagebot is my current demon. Although, I guess I don't really have all that much to say about it particularly, since I'm still more or less fighting with my own self, my own mind, and such things to get into shape effectively.
Round 1. Fight.
One of the main things to understand about Kagebot is actually that that's not really a bot for just practicing Mikis. Interestingly, despite being the moderate bot for that, he's more so a matter of being aware enough during your own offense that you aren't autopiloting your offense, or if you are playing a character who really can afford to autopilot the offense, there are a few after all,
Round 2. Fight.
to make you realize that getting into the correct position for your offense can be really beneficial depending on your character. Necalli is one of those characters. While he does obviously use charge moves, one of the largest differences between him and Urien, at least at this level of play, because Uriens at higher levels are generally more like what I'm about to say, he has to do a lot of walking forward in very specific situations in order to get what he wants, but he also lacks the really long mid-range normal that can be, I'm forcing you to block, and while I'm doing that, I'm charging.
You win.
This is probably fine, as Necalli really only has one charge-based move that matters in these situations, and otherwise can use his stomp in most of the same situations.
Round 1.
But he is, as many have complained actually, quite a straightforward character who wins mostly by repeating more or less the same thing. This means, however, that you have to really perfect it. And it's not necessarily footsies per se either. This is probably why he has one of the least punishable sweep in the game, and enough range and enough limit on the pushback for his stand heavy kick. He is often in a position where if you block his stand heavy kick, you just can't walk forward because he's going to do something, and that something is not only going to probably beat you if you tried, it's usually safe for him to just do. Once he is in V-trigger, that compounds a lot. Even though the character doesn't really change that much other than in terms of frame data and speed, you're just doing the same thing but faster. You're getting a bigger reward for all your efforts to get into the right position or read your opponent's movement correctly. And your V-trigger just helps you do that better. Which is presumably why it is actually allowed to just last and sit there. He gets basically the V-cancel itself, some new kind of shenanigan-y things to go with it, and aside from that, he just straight up powers up his physical prowess. His ability to actually play the way he was playing before is enhanced. But there's very little additional damage that Necalli gets without you performing to get it. But there's that perfectly spaced stomp, for example. Pushing Cosmic Wolf back to basically the same situation of, okay, this is working fine, but now I have to add here. His current work, however, has more to do with punishes, because as we mentioned, execution is the thing. Interestingly, he's quite good at the execution for the anti-air, it's more so the awareness. So, there are some other things that are more important in terms of playing Necalli. Specifically, timing when to hit buttons out of block stun. For people who don't practice that much, or who don't get a lot of exposure to things, especially online play, where not only can the block stun feel weird, it can visually actually become weird depending on which frames the system chooses to skip in order to keep this fluidity of it. This is different for different games netcode, so it doesn't necessarily apply to all games, but generally, characters with unusually long block stun can be really stressful for characters like Necalli. He doesn't really punish with direct specials, but you can't just mash medium punch, wait for medium punch to hit, and then be ready.
Cut that a little close.
Round 2. Fight.
This is the part of fighting games that mostly comes from experience. And our aim is often to get you to the point of feeling comfortable enough in the game to constantly seek more of said experience, rather than feeling discouraged. Just feeling confident in being able to react, trusting your body to do what is required to solve some situation or another. and therefore ending up being more able to deal damage in positions you weren't even thinking of.
I must say along those lines that this whole automatically teching most dash throws thing that BisonBot gave me is very nice. Because Amara would usually get me almost every time on that, and now I say I'm teching about 80% of them, perhaps?
The important thing in those situations is actually to check whether or not you teched or your opponent did. Now, while we do often say that you should attempt to make sure that you teched that the throw escape appeared on your side, training with BisonBot will help you even if that's not what you actually achieve, because most characters who dash up into anything are not looking for a very specific trick that can be done at higher levels. You can take your time and build up the skills surrounding that one. It is possible to dash up and only throw the extended limb that happens if your opponent tries to do it. In fact, there are entire setups for Ryu versus Lara, for example, where Ryu sets it up so that he is only throwing Lara's Rift throw animation.
That is some impressive spacing.
But, in general, the pressury type of dash throw, where your opponent is just hoping that you don't react in time, if you are really fast, your opponent dashing into your throw is just something that they have to take. They can't do too much about it, except if they have to throw invincible moves and they dash up and do those. So for a character like Ryu, you can face some problems, and they're not always the easiest of problems to deal with, because most of us don't actually respond that well to Ryu dash up light uppercut. But working in different little pieces of style across all the games we play, the rule is the same for the team. Learn how to set up the situation you want first, and in your downtime, practice how to actually capitalize off that situation. So in this case, it's Amara's ability to jump in and land the jump in, or at least force you to just block it instead of actually anti-airing. That is the main thing to be worked on. Eventually, if she does get to the point where, okay, I'm getting all the jump-ins, but my opponent just techs all my throws, she can work on the other part of that, which is things like, if the opponent is specifically trying to walk out of it after a jumping heavy kick that went really far, or similar, at that point you can actually do lows, which is one of the first things most people learn in fighting games, and yet one that doesn't come up that much in Street Fighter V anymore. Most people just don't do the jump in, force you to block standing, then into low, because it doesn't necessarily work that well. It's relatively easy to detect jump in timings and spacings, and therefore to make sure that you are still moving to crouch block right afterwards. It's not specifically that it was too much harder before, but the way that the block stun in the game is for certain moves is different. This one's been changed, I think, since Street Fighter 4, which is where we got a lot more of the empty jump low situation. Because the only way to mess up the opponent is to make there be no block stun at all, and throw off their timing that way. But as you build up execution, that becomes more and more important. That moment of, can I get my opponent to block the thing that will lead to the mix-up? How often can I do this without getting, like, stopped or countered against a good opponent? And that's one of the main things to spend your time testing against stronger opponents. Even if you can't actually get them to stop blocking, you can't manage the frame trap, or you can't manage the mix-up, get them to block it. Because if you can get them to block it, it's just a matter of physical practice at that point. If the mix-up is real, and they've blocked it, then you get to go into the mix-up. Your physical inability to do the mix-up at that point means you aren't going to win the match, but all of the work that brought you to that point, presuming it was work and not just randomness, is still paying off.
Round one. Fight.
All that HP.
Looks like I won. Right. Round two. Fight.
Can he cancel Hyper Bomb out of that elbow
Well, that's
turn
just,
thing?
well, actually I don't,
What was that, timing or what was that?
it's really plus.
I see.
Like, really plus.
Round one.
Alright.
Fight.
What a pain.
That is in fact one of the mix-ups we're talking about. Alex doesn't always have real pressure, but when he does, you can in fact think of him as the most positive man on earth.
I see.
For those who are not aware, Alex was in fact buffed in Season 4 in two ways. One relating to frame data, as a general thing. A lot of his slower normals got put back to spaces and timings and so on. And some hitboxes were added for if you try to jump out of certain things, and so on for his lariat. But more importantly, his V skill previously gave the effect of a counter hit. Any move that was hit after his B skill charged him up became a counter hit. And counter hits in this game increase the amount you are plus, the amount you are advantaged, by 2 frames. It's a very small amount of time, but in terms of how the game works, all you have to understand about it if you're a beginner is that if you think you could have hit a medium button before to stop him, even though he was at a specific spot, but you weren't sure, like sometimes it seemed to work and sometimes it didn't. As soon as he has that set up, now he cannot be stopped. This generally didn't matter too much because obviously if Alex had advantage, he was hitting you. And it was not really a question of did he hit the right or the wrong thing, because you should probably be blocking. However, his V-skill was buffed to make it so that when he does land such a hard hit, rather than just being the additional 2 extra frames, 30th of a second of advantage, he now has 5, which is a 12th of a second, and actually a big deal. Because this means that now his standing medium kick is much more dangerous. This allows Alex to do things like stand medium punch into stand heavy punch, or stand medium kick, followed by stand medium punch, which it doesn't come out that often because obviously a medium kick would be like long range, but these are minorly important things with a very heavy focus on his ability to do things from light attacks but he wasn't able to before. I'm sure we will get a report from DeWolf at some point as to what does and does not work for this, because as far as I remember there is some limitation on a couple of these moves. But you can always check online, especially on Twitter, where people will be happy to help you understand all of the whole specifics of any given character if you can just search for them enough.
Round 1. Fight!
On Akali bots actually have... Yes, we have to. On Akali bots are generally specific to just stopping jump-ins and so on. This is partially because Akali's jump-in buttons are really good, making him a good candidate for making sure you anti-air early enough. And he's a good, easy bot for the most part to get started with, even though Akali bot 2 is a little bit rougher. But it's a similar reasoning to Alex bot. Akali's character isn't really one where you spend a lot of time trying to figure out his tricks, per se. You learn how to block certain things correctly and not respond when you shouldn't, and the rest is up to you. You have to figure out how the player wants to play Akali, more so than you need to figure out Akali's craziness, let's say. He has a bit of it. But he's more so a solid character who you are often fighting your opponent a lot more than you are fighting your own lack of knowledge. However, we did manage to get a Akali bot with a specific goal in mind by work on Blanca bot a while back. But he's not one you're likely to see too often, as even in that form, he doesn't have a lot of uses. He's more so for people who have trouble with specific aspects of their anti-airs, or managing to space themselves properly so you don't get jumped on in particular ways. We are still, of course, working to refine whatever we can, particularly for bots that have only been input on one system or one account before now, due to
Uh-oh. It appears that network issues have taken away our Aurelian. We'll get that taken care of as soon as we can. Alright, hopefully that will take care of the lack of Aurelian. Oh. But if not, as internet is sometimes strange, we will just have to keep going a little bit.
we are in fact still perfecting a few things relative to how to input bots, and more importantly, much more importantly, how to guide other people to do so, as obviously our initial attempts have basically just been, hey, here's some inputs, try to do this.
And welcome back. Yes, I especially appreciate the new first frame trick, because for certain bots that became a massive pain.
I have a new first frame trick, actually.
Oh, and what is that like?
I'll probably explain it relative to Urian bot. So for anyone attempting to input our Urian bot, it has an action 3 that is a real pain to do. Because the action 3 specifically says, hold down back for a specific amount of time. Now if you are using stick or the stick on a thing, sometimes this works out well for you, but it has a really precise amount of time you need to hold it and a bunch of other things. But one thing that is true is that while the button input trick that we use normally only works when you, or is only intended to work by you hitting an input button, you can use it the other way. So if an input specifically says, start this at down back, but only go through down back for a short time, you can actually make sure that you don't hit back at the beginning by starting there. So you hold back on the pad while the first second before the actual recording is starting, and it will just stick like that. It won't consider that back input at all. Then you move to down back and you're done. It has to be correct, as it would automatically have ignored any back inputs. There are probably a couple other bots where this might be a bit more useful than you think.
That actually sounds super useful.
So this is for those of you who have either slightly wobbly hands, slightly difficult precision on your very first press of the button, or even in some cases slightly worn out controllers, because, well, we can't all be just buying perfect new controllers just to play fighting games until we get better and have some confidence that, you know what, this might actually be worth my money. Or maybe you just don't have the time right now to do it. Any number of reasons. But we promise you that if you play enough fighting games, your controllers will suffer for it. And then you retire them to some other realm where they do something else.
I was so expecting to die to that.
But I'll be looking into that. It seemed to help quite a lot with a particular part of the input, because it really, really requires that to work in order to be good. So I've tested that today, and I'll be retrying some of my own Urian bot inputs for the same reason. Of course, the more of the team owns a character, the more different inputs of the same bot we've got. We've often done multiple attempts at it and seen how it goes, but we don't often get to do the extensive testing that lets us know, is this slight difference actually a problem? So we can be a little bit lazier / more lenient, especially on bots that people are used to fighting when we gather up, and so on, and weren't relying on their own account to even have. It's a little bit better to leave in the tiny flaws and see how much it really affects it, so that we can finally add some information to the page on whether or not it really is too much trouble. We often do a lot of testing on things like leniency, and we err on the side of none. In other words, if we have not managed to get it to work with a more lenient input consistently, then we just tell you, no, it doesn't work. But the ranges are a little bit unknown, and there may be some ways to get some uses out of lenient input things, if things go in a little choppily, or it may be possible to just realize, oh, the problem that we thought it wasn't actually that. The input didn't really have that big a problem. We thought it was timing when it was some other small thing that was difficult to see. So having extra players using them always helps. Similarly, anyone actually attempting to input or use our bots, we are quite happy to answer anything you have in terms of problems in them. You can do this either directly or even openly with our Twitter account 2_MK_FGC. It might help if you sent us some video link to demonstrate generally like 5-10 minutes of you what it is actually doing. Though obviously, in the interest of time, you should probably try to get it as perfect as possible, and similarly err on the side of leniency. So we're talking more along the lines of things that make you think, you know, this looks fine, this is working well for me, I wonder if it leads to a problem that I am not aware of, because I didn't design it.
So I actually have a question unrelated to that now. Since your earlier comment made me suddenly hyper-aware of which side the throw tech marker pops up on. What is the benefit, difference, or such to being the one who did the teching, specifically? Or is it just in that situation, it's a question of whether the person could have done something else that would have messed up your otherwise throw?
Your aim when you expect a throw, in general, is to tech as late as possible. It does affect certain character spacing, or at least it used to. It got really annoying for a while because we had like a big controversy as to whether or not it actually did that. But it also has to do with what moves you're doing at the time and a bunch of other little strange things. But the main thing to think about is that it is possible that your opponent went for a jab, or something else. And in the case of a walk-up throw, that can mean that you got counter-hit, because you started up your own, and there you go. Now you'd think, well, how is that ever going to happen? Who is ever going to hit throw literally almost the same time as someone else hits jab? Well, have you played Guilty Gear? This is generally a thing that players at reasonably high levels can just do. So, in certain situations, knowing that your opponent is going to dash up, but not knowing what they're going to do, but, for whatever reason, not feeling like you can actually respond to that dash, can be a big deal. You can of course also learn to recognize spacings where your opponent's dash throw will not reach you unless you do something, and then just walk away from them. Or even something equivalent to wave dashing. You can probably find it on, I think Shen streams about this. There are various top level players that will point out to you one of the most important things you can learn to do in this game is walk backward while defending your legs. Because if you don't do this correctly, it often leads to big problems.
I suppose a wave dashing-ish sort of technique would take advantage of proximity block for that. If you're constantly shifting between back and down back, a proximity block will catch you.
It's very dependent on character. There's a lot of small specifics to it that matter a ton.
I see.
For example, MOV has this technique partially because if you hit Chun-Li's stand light kick, you might die in the same situations where you might want to hit her crouch light kick. Her crouch light kick is quite far forward, stops a ton of things, really messes up certain opponents. Doesn't necessarily combo that well, not really confirmable per se, but if you saw your opponent dash and you knew you were going to hit them, you could confirm it. But if you hit stand light kick, chances are you're going to die.
Round one.
It is 2 frames slower now, and does not hit crouching. So there are a few characters where you really want that additional range from their crouching move, or you really want to make sure you're not hitting the crouching move. So this is additionally not just guarding your legs, but making sure that you do the correct attack to check your opponent's advance. Juri as a character needs this a lot, in fact. If Juri mistimes some of her backward movement, she becomes more vulnerable to low attacks than a lot of characters, as she's not necessarily prepared to deal with them without doing some fairly committed things. And even if you don't mean committed in terms of, oh, you're unsafe now, if she was aiming to maintain a spacing, doing certain moves messes with that spacing and she has to try to get all the way back there. This is just another one of the tiny things that helps you decide between characters, for example. Does this character have trouble maintaining space while defending themselves or not? Or are you the sort of player who does fine without even caring about that a little bit? Colleen, for example, really doesn't actually maintain her space that well. She can, but if she really wants to play footsies, it's quite difficult. Her hail moves her forward. Her crouch medium kick in certain spacings moves her forward. Parabellum moves her forward. I don't even remember. I literally don't remember if her crouch heavy punch moves her forward or not. I don't think it does. Because I am so used to the idea that this character doesn't maintain spacing while hitting buttons. If I want to keep my spacing with Colleen, I hit stand medium punch, which is basically the only thing I know of that doesn't move her and reaches quite far, or just don't hit buttons. But she's not really a character who's trying to maintain her spacing a lot in the first place, so it's not really relevant.
Round one. Fight.
I find that I really want to hit Nikali with my effectively walk-up stand heavy punch, but I also find myself coming out sort of short for it. Or, if not, then getting hit by his, is that stand heavy kick.
Well, this is because you're facing a player who's used to playing Yuri, who's very good at moving slightly out of range of things, and forcing you to advance more than you otherwise would.
I see.
That is one of Urian's strengths as a character, and Nikali can definitely be played in mostly the same way. It's just that he takes much bigger risks to punish people for coming forward. Urian has like his crouch medium kick, which was once the best button in the game, and his stand medium kick, which is super long, and also a great button with some good confirms. Nikali has to hit heavy in those situations more often than not, but if he's spaced right, he doesn't actually care. Still just working out for him.
Let's see. Well, alright then.
So,
more for me to learn, I suppose.
You win.
Or
it is
get used to
likely, yes, that this is not a standard thing you have to train. This is another thing you need to occasionally put into practice when playing against multiple different people. Even if you know that something isn't really too important to a matchup, but you've been having trouble doing it against a different character, try and see if you have trouble against that character too, because that lets you know whether or not it was your issue, or that that character or that player is really good at it. We have done very specific training at one point for OmniRabbit on this actually. I think it was actually a stream quite a while ago of playing the Laura Mirror with the Wolf for this purpose, in that Unrabbit got very used to, in the Laura Mirror and against certain people in other characters, stand heavy kick reaching, but because the Wolf plays that same style, who he has in the past played Nikali, He just walks out of it and then repunishes it with alarming regularity, simply because Oni Rabbit became used to hitting that button at that space and met an opponent who didn't stand there anymore.
Yes. And I can come back to Amara and be able to do it again, although she'll cause me some of my own troubles. So alright. The question just becomes then, what do I want to do instead versus him? Or if it's just something that I can adapt to, which it sounds like it might be, in terms of spacing, although it will make my life more difficult.
Well, that's fighting games for you, making your opponent's life difficult, one step at a time. Sometimes literally one step at a time. But of course, as we mentioned before, this is about style, understanding and developing your own, figuring out what it is you like to do and how to get to it. Because that part is often important in these games. There's the correct way to play the character, and then there's the way you want to play the character. And if you play long enough, you'll often find that those are the same thing if you really like the character and actually like, not just like them conceptually, but just looked at everything they did and decided, I like all these things. I have no idea how to put them together, but I definitely like them. You shouldn't necessarily worry that you won't find the way to get there. There's probably someone out there who has figured out to do it the way you want to do it. And if not, you might still want to push. You might be the first one to find it.
Indeed,
But there are definitely people who can help you more if you can tell them what it is you want. One well-known thing, for example, is that for Ryu playing against footsie characters, Ryu's stand medium kick is not really for playing footsies so much as it is to keep the opponent quiet. It is effectively a guard break against other Ryu players though. Hitting it against them will generally make them more likely to try to do something that he can then stop. This works on Karine when she is just outside of range where she wants to whiff punish but happens to get hit by the medium kick. Because Ryu can then hit crouch medium kick and stop her advances. Whereas other characters usually have like some little hop or instant attack that they can do to either go into a strike or something like that. Karine actually lacks this quite heavily compared to most characters. So it's a very specific thing against a very specific type of Karine player. But if you learn to use it, it can let you get certain things on her if you really want them. And if you decide, I don't really care about that, why do I want to like make Karine walk at me? I'm happy with her over there. Then you have no problems and don't need to use the button.
Oof, 8-frame sweep.
But what will often happen is that you'll eventually get to a higher level, you'll decide, you know what, maybe I like doing that occasionally. Maybe every now and then I need to throw out the medium kick just to make this Karine walk at me. Or to make them think about it. Or just to make them think about the medium kick as a general thing. And you don't have anything else to do in the matches for whatever reason, let's say. So you decide, I'm going to master that now, because I might need it. That's generally how high-level styles that seem similar to each other tend to evolve. Just people doing things that the character is capable of, just how much they care about any given one, where they were in their style when they learned it, etc.
And so that same sort of thing is basically where that particular thought came from. Because I really like walking up and hitting people in the face with stand heavy punch. So I'll have to somehow figure out how to do that against Cosmic Wolf's Nikali. Or I guess maybe figure out what I want to do instead.
It could be that you don't really want to hit him with Stand Heavy Punch. That was the last discussion that we were having, and it's probably a fitting end to the stream. When one is first getting used to fighting games, it's very easy to get caught up in the idea that because you did something this way on one character, or because people talk about doing it that way on their character, that you should use the same button for your own character. Or the same button you always use. But it does help somewhat to, rather than think about button versus button or button versus spacing, consider the situation you got into. If you want to walk up and hit Nikali, and your general feeling is, I want to walk up and hit Stand Heavy Punch, but for whatever reason, Nikali's retracting hitboxes, or who knows, whatever it is, this doesn't work on him. It could just mean that you want to hit something else to do the same thing. Now, again, with Karin, this is not necessarily true because she's sort of limited in it sometimes. But there might be something somewhere in there that just works for her in a way that doesn't work otherwise normally.
And so that's likely enough, and I'll have to give it some thought, I suppose.
Because Nikali's moves are the type that probably you'd get your Stand Medium Punch more easily than the Stand Heavy Punch. And it's not as if the Stand Medium Punch is like short range or anything.
It is indeed the next one I thought of. I seem to think it's short range, but it's probably not that much worse than the Stand Heavy Punch for sure, so I have a tendency to underestimate my buttons. Oops.
That said, as usual, we'll be ending the stream fairly soon. The lounge itself often stays open until about 9:30 Eastern for various reasons. So anyone who is joining, has joined, shouldn't really be expecting it to end altogether, but probably we're not necessarily going to have much to say, and therefore the streaming aspect of the lounge is likely to end. Given the flow, we are probably back to streaming at least some of the days. We're going to work out exactly which ones we're continuing to do it with. Or if we're going to continue streaming all days every week, every Monday, every other Monday.
Basically everything.
One thing you can count on is that generally, if we do stream on any given day, it will follow the timing format that we normally have, and that means that you can look for those tweets this week at 2_MK_FGC. If you don't see them, presume no stream, but the standard is, as you are now seeing, the Monday Mish-Mashing Battle Lounge for Street Fighter V. The Tuesday Train, Guilty Gear Xrd Rev 2. We have some work to do on that as well from Frosty. Wednesday, the one that is least likely to be done, but is often either what we call sandbag casuals, or some other game. We tend to showcase other fighting games at that time space. And we have a couple that might actually get a look at them. Not necessarily this week, but in the coming weeks. On Thursday is almost always Kame House, our beginner Dragon Ball Fighter lobby. We're still pretty sure we're Dragon Ball Fighters beginners. We don't practice it that much, even though we do have the bots available. They do get some looks though, and with the new characters out, we may be taking a look at them as well. That's more likely to actually happen this Thursday than specifically any Wednesday stream.
Round one.
And Friday
Fight.
is often our bot release day, so you can always look around for that soon after Capcom announces any new character. They will occasionally pop up anyway if we are doing research into DBFZ bots, which may come up with the result of the changes. We might reprioritize certain things, or find that our bots have lost some abilities due to the system changes, and made some shifts around and let you know through those guidance streams. Generally, when those do not happen, Dead or Alive last round. That is Dead or Alive 5, even though obviously within the coming weeks, who knows, who's to say it won't be Dead or Alive 6. We spent very little time on the beta for that game, notably because we expect that DOA is going to continue to be DOA, and given the characters available in the beta, best to leave us out of it when we just be like killing time with characters we don't play that well. So assuming that the beta did have a load problem at any point, leave it to the people who actually are interested in learning or testing. I did get some time with Kasumi, found her to be pretty much the same, a little bit weaker per se, not in the sense that she is a weak character, but that it was more difficult to do certain things that I personally like doing, but we'll see what happens. This, however, is again our last on-stream match of the night. This has been Rillian for Team 2MK, along with Rune Siren aka Kansuki Dynasty.
It's go time.
Good luck with your training, and good night everyone.